مساء الخير وأهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من واشنطن أونلاين. معي أنا هدي العويس على نورث بريس. في خطاب صارخ في تناقضه يدافع أردوغان عن أهالي غزة في خطاب، ويحرض ويعلن عن حملات عسكرية تضرب الآمنين في شمال سوريا في خطاب آخر. فهل يغطي الصراع الحالي الجاري بين إسرائيل وحماس على جرائم تركيا المتتالية في الشمال السوري، أم أن ما يحدث اليوم في غزة سيجلب من جديد الانتباه والاهتمام الأمريكي إلى منطقة الشرق الأوسط وتحديداً سوريا؟ وهل يؤدي ما يحدث اليوم إلى تصعيد أمريكي ضد الوجود الإيراني في شرق سوريا، وذلك بسبب خشية أمريكا وتل أبيب من فتح جبهات عسكرية إيرانية جديدة ضد إسرائيل من الأراضي السورية؟ هذا ما أبحثه في حلقة اليوم من واشنطن أونلاين مع ضيوفي، وهما السيد توم جاريت عضو مجلس النواب الأمريكي السابق ينضم إلينا من ولاية فيرجينيا. ابقوا معنا لمتابعة هذه الحلقة. أهلا وسهلا بك ضيفي السيد توم جاريت عضو مجلس النواب الأمريكي السابق، ضيفي في حلقة اليوم من واشنطن أونلاين. سيد جاريت، هل تخشون من أن تأخذ أحداث غزة والصراع بين حماس وإسرائيل كل الاهتمام السياسي والإعلامي الأمريكي اليوم بشكل قد يتم استغلاله من قبل تركيا ومن قبل الرئيس أردوغان ليكون هناك تصعيد أكبر ضد شمال وشمال شرق سوريا؟ المنطقة كانت قد نعت عدد من ضحايا القصف والاستهداف التركي دون أن نرى ردود أفعال واضحة من الجانب الأمريكي. هل ممكن أن تلعب الأحداث في غزة فعلا ضد مصالح الاستقرار في الشمال السوري؟
Well, I think it's the latest thing that's taking attention from the atrocities against a largely civilian target set in northeast Syria. And I say the latest because it was obviously Ukraine for some period of time. But if you look back, 6 days or a week ago, a U.S. jet shot down a Turkish drone that was menacing U.S. forces in northeast Syria. You've seen Turkish attacks around Amuda and Kamishli and Hasake and Ioannina all in the last month, and really for years before that. But in the West, there was never any attention. There was always something more important as far as whomever determines what gets our news attention, which I think compounds the tragedy of the Kurdish people and certainly magnified in the north and eastern Syria, Rojava region.
نعم سيد جاريت، من ردود أفعال إدارة الرئيس جو بايدن حتى قبل أحداث غزة على القصف التركي المتكرر ضد شمال شرق سوريا، هل ترى التزام لدى إدارة جو بايدن بمكافحة وهزيمة تنظيم داعش الإرهابي وإرساء الاستقرار في شمال سوريا؟
You know, I've been personally very afraid following the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan that this administration lacked the resolve to remain reliable to groups who had been amazingly reliable to the United States, right? My core personal belief that every human life has value sort of drives my empathy with the struggle of people in northeast Syria for autonomy and self-determination. But that happens all over the world. There's a civil war in Myanmar that's been going on for almost 80 years where a lightly armed minority group is being murdered by government, and the United States and the West don't seem to be paying attention to that either. You've seen 100,000 ethnic Armenians displaced in Azerbaijan in the last few months, and that really doesn't make the news either. So, what you do at North Press, what you do yourself to shine light on these things, it's so important because I'm afraid that those who are more fortunate in the West don't act or care or do the right thing, not because they're not morally inclined to, but because they simply lack information. So I do think that the tragedies in Israel and Gaza have detracted from our understanding of the conflict that's ongoing in north and eastern Syria, but that's just the latest thing to do that. And I hope that this administration doesn't confuse a lack of interest in the humanity and the violations there too in North and Eastern Syria with a lack of importance, right? There aren't people interested because they don't know about it, but that doesn't mean it's not important to keep our word and to do the right thing in the region. So I've been concerned with a wavering commitment for at least 2 years in Syria and even across the border into Iraqi Kurdistan.
نعم، بعد أن استهدفت تركيا المدنيين في شمال سوريا ودمرت البنى التحتية المدنية في المنطقة، قال الرئيس أردوغان أنه أنهى المرحلة الأولى من العملية الأمنية في تلك المنطقة. ما هي المراحل المقبلة؟ هل يخشى من تقدم وغزو بري لمناطق جديدة في شمال سوريا، وهل ستسمح الإدارة الأمريكية بذلك؟
Sure. We can't know. I am convinced, and I can't speak to this in any detail, that Turkey leveraged the Western desires to have Finland and Sweden come into NATO against U.S. and humanitarian interests in the Middle East. And so I think that they were able to seize concessions that allowed for some of the aggression and the establishing of what Erdogan calls a buffer zone. Obviously, it is within the legitimate interest of Turkey to have security and stability. But I think that relatively speaking, those goals have long since been achieved. And if we go back even 40 years into the acts of the assembly in Turkey, there's an ingrained systemic anti-Kurdish sentiment that's been documented in legislation, right? So I'm not sure what the goal is. I do know that whether it's Armenians 100 years ago or Kurds for the last 50 years and even longer, that the Turks under Erdogan and even previously have shown very little tolerance for those who do not identify themselves as Turkish, right? The glide path to acceptance in Turkey is to set aside any Kurdish ethnic identity and say you're Turkish, and you might be able to make a living and live without some fear. But if you, for a moment, assert a Kurdish identity, you're in danger. And so PYD's, affiliation with PKK as it relates to Erdogan's story has been his entree into oppression. I just don't buy it. And I don't think that the global community should either.
سيد جاريت، الأحداث الأخيرة في غزة تجلب من جديد الاهتمام الأمريكي إلى منطقة الشرق الأوسط. رأينا الجيش الأمريكي يحرك أساطيله في المنطقة للمرة الأولى من سنوات طويلة. رأينا المزيد من الجنود الأمريكيين ينشطون في مناطق محيطة بسوريا ومحيطة بمناطق تواجد الجيش الأمريكي في شرق سوريا. ألا يساعد هذا الموضوع الاستقرار في شمال شرق سوريا وقوات سوريا الديمقراطية؟
I'm hopeful that the United States foreign policy reverts to something like we saw under the previous administration. And I don't want to turn this interview into an argument over Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. But what we do know is that Iranian foreign monetary reserves under Trump had dwindled to about $6 billion US. And in 2.5 years under Biden, they're up to $70 billion. We do know that we released $6 billion on top of $10 billion prior to that for the Iranians to use ostensibly for humanitarian expenses. But if you can spend all of your $16 billion new dollars on humanitarian expenses, that frees up $16 billion old dollars to spend funding elements like Hezbollah and Hamas, right? If you connect the dots backwards in the region, if it doesn't go to Erdogan, it goes to the mullahs in Iran, right? So I think that the best outcomes would be a United States that recognizes that giving Turkey whatever they want in order to expand NATO, that playing nice with people who spend money and shed blood through the IRGC and proxy wars across Syria and the entire region and Yemen, etc., will not placate them, right? We keep thinking that we can feed the alligator and hope that he eats us last. And that just doesn't work. So it's going to take a wholesale change in U.S. foreign policy because, frankly, Iran is far more powerful than they were just 3 years ago, even if you quantify it just in terms of money, and you can walk what's happened obviously in Gaza, but also in northern Israel and the West Bank directly back to financiers in Iran. I read an article by Michael Rubin, who I think's been on your channel before, who trained the people who flew the paragliders in the Gaza attacks. And we can almost definitively link that back to Iran as well. So until we look evil in the eye and it looks back at us and we recognize it for what it is, I fear that this is going to escalate, and the victims become, I've stood outside of Minbij and looked through binoculars at people who I know were funded and supported by Iran, who I know were allowed across the border by Turkey. And I'm not privy to the same information that the President of the United States or National Security Council is. And so if I know it, then they know it. And yet we continue to work with these folks as if somehow giving them more money and being nice is going to cause them to change how they do business. There's no reason to believe that. So the West has got to recognize evil for what it is and treat it as such, or it's going to continue and it will indeed get worse. And we'll feel it last. And that's what makes me sad. Not that I want my family and my homeland to feel this, but people in innumerable places around the world, including North and Eastern Syria, are suffering on a scale that most Americans can't relate to, but we will be able to. If we don't stand up and look evil in the eye and say no now, we'll have to do it later.
نعم، ولكن مثلما تعلم سيد جاريت، هناك كثر في شمال شرق سوريا وهنا في واشنطن يلومون الرئيس دونالد ترامب على ما حدث في 2019 والغزو التركي لمناطق رأس العين وتل أبيض. لديك رأي مختلف، هل فعلا المنطقة ستكون أكثر أمانا مع الحزب الجمهوري ونحن مقبلون على سنة انتخابية في الولايات المتحدة؟
Well, if you look at was it Qasem Soleimani, who was the head of the IRGC that Donald Trump executed? And folks like Joe Biden immediately recoiled and said, oh, the horror, we can't, but we could draw his actions and commands directly to the death of hundreds of Americans, right? Let alone people in Iraq and in Syria. And what we saw was a remarkably quick rolling up of ISIS, large credit to the brave men and women in the SDF and YPG, but also the American air assets and special operations community under President Trump. And it's creeping back in. And frankly, again, we've chosen, at least the West media, really not to look at it. It's hard to ignore if you live in Hasakeh or Qamishli, but you ask the average American what's going on in North and Eastern Syria, and they can't find North and Eastern Syria on a map. And again, that's all well and good if we're lucky enough to live here. But if we don't confront evil at some point, if we don't stand up to people who do the right thing, then we will have to do it later. So when we find allies who we share values with, right, there are criticisms that I have of some political decisions that have been made in various regions, including North and Eastern Syria. However, I can't criticize people who think that you should be able to live without fear in the place of your birth, regardless of whether you're Muslim or Yazidi or Christian or what have you, right? And that sort of multi-ethnic, multicultural society of tolerance is something that Americans, if we're going to live up to the words that we were founded upon, should be encouraging, not sort of ignoring or using as a leverage item to bring new countries into NATO. Because I guarantee you again that Turkey leveraged their position, their desire to have greater regional influence, which translates into oppress Kurds and control large swaths of Syria, into again the expansion of NATO. So we let them do it. We should have said, no, you guys can be in NATO, or if you don't want to be in NATO, we're taking these folks. And those are tough decisions, but in order to avoid tougher decisions, you need to make the tough ones today. I think we failed to do that. And again, the price is paid in blood on the ground by our friends, by people who are my friends. I hope they're America's friends.
شكرا جزيلا لك ضيفي السيد توم جاريت، عضو مجلس النواب الأمريكي السابق، كنت معنا من فرجينيا. وختاما شكرا لكل من تابع حلقة اليوم من واشنطن أونلاين. ألقاكم في حلقة جديدة الأسبوع المقبل، إلى اللقاء.